I think we'll just get started as folks keep joining us. Thanks so much for joining for the fifth out of six webinars for our national webinar series this year. Really excited about this one, Invasive Wild Pigs Collaborative Management Efforts in BC. Invasives Canada has been working on wild pigs for quite a lot the last few months, so it'll be nice to hear from Emily on this topic. On to our main event. Tuning in from BC, I'm happy to introduce Emily Lomas. Emily is a wildlife biologist with a Bachelor of Science from the University of British Columbia and a master's from Thompson Rivers University, where she studied the effects of human disturbance on the body characteristics and movement patterns of Western rattlesnakes in South Okanagan. She joined the provincial government in 2019 after several years in municipal government and biological consulting. She has worked on a variety of topics with a focus on human-wildlife conflict prevention and conservation issues. Emily is currently focused on mitigating the threats from invasive animals through science-informed policy and action. She is the provincial early detection rapid response coordinator for the terrestrial animals, supporting early detection rapid response advisory committee, and is also chair of the American Bullfrog Action Team and the BC Feral Pig Working Group. And related to her work on that feral pig working group, Emily will spend the next 45-ish minutes or so talking with us about the work being done in the province to address the feral pig problem. And with that, I'll stop sharing. And Emily, I'll pass things over to you.
Thanks, Chris. I will just share my slides here. You let me know. Okay, awesome. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you to the Canadian Council of Invasive Species, or Invasives Canada now, for having me today. My name is Emily, and I'm the Terrestrial Invasive Fauna Specialist with the BC Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. And I am calling in today from the Tk'emlúps to Secwe territory, which is in the southern interior in British Columbia. So I'm calling in from just outside of Tk'emlúps, BC. So we should have, I'm going to talk today about pigs in BC and our response and some of the actions that we're taking. And we should have quite a bit of time for questions if you guys have questions at the end. But if anything pops up in the chat in the meantime, please feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind if there's something burning urgent. And yeah, so I think we'll jump right into it. So I'm just going to give a little bit of overview on wild pigs, and this is really a catch-all term. So you could hear the term wild pigs, wild boar, feral swine, and more. The term I'll be using from now on is feral pigs, and that's because that's how we define these animals in our legislation and our Wildlife Act. But a lot of these terms are interchangeable, and essentially what they are, in the 1980s and 90s, Eurasian boar were introduced to Canada to expand livestock production and also expand opportunities for new hunting experiences. And of course, they weren't just introduced to Canada, but to the States and to other countries as well. So since then, we've had a lot of farm escapes and then intentional releases, including when the market for these animals dwindled and they were no longer seen as valuable, perhaps, and instead of taking care of their herd, people also intentionally release them or kind of just let them loose on the landscape. So over time, this farmed Eurasian wild boar species has bred, it's interbred, it's multiplied, and has spread rapidly. So because because these are interbred and hybrids with domestic animals as well, they vary in appearance, size, and color, but generally we treat all of feral pigs, wild boar the same. So they are an extremely successful invasive species. They have early sexual maturity. In some areas, they can breed year-round or have multiple litters. They can eat just about anything. They are long-lived and very adaptable to all kinds of temperatures. They use varied habitats. So you can see how this might make them, have several traits that enable them to really thrive in the wild. And some of their behaviors are just taken from an excerpt of one of our infographics, trampling, rooting, wallowing, rubbing. I'll talk a little bit more about that, about how that affects our environment. So some of their impacts to native wildlife, of course, direct predation and competition, but also ecosystem damage. So they alter terrestrial and aquatic habitats. They're destructive to vegetation, soils, wetlands in particular, and can really degrade water quality. So in BC, or I'll get to BC in a minute, but so more impacts actually on top of environmental damage. We've got agriculture damage, of course. So there's impacts directly to crops, but also to livestock. And they are also hosts and vectors for over 40 parasites and over 30 diseases. And one of the main diseases that we are concerned about is African swine fever, which I won't really have time to get into today, but we don't have in Canada, and we don't want to have it in Canada. If we did and it was detected in domestic or wild pigs, it would shut down our pork industry. So, of course, there's other cultural values for values on the land that they're impacting, public safety concerns. There have been human injuries from pigs in the States, including a death and people hitting these animals with their cars and causing injuries that way. And then, of course, really large financial impacts in areas where they are established. So in the States, the latest estimate is that $2.5 billion per year is spent in these damages, and over 75 million has been spent over 5 years in just control costs for these animals. So here's my slide about BC specific impacts, things that we are concerned about here for the environment would be their rooting behavior in streams and wallowing would increase sediment load. So in important salmon spawning habitat, that would be of great concern, and also degrading that water quality for other animals using the water source. They can spread E. coli and other things. They compete with native wildlife for food, especially ungulates in BC would be direct competition. It impact breeding habitats due to that rooting and wallowing behavior. And then some species at risk that we would be concerned about, ground nesting birds. You may have seen one of the photos in one of my previous slides of a pig predating on ground nesting bird eggs. So we have sharp-tailed grouse, short-eared owl, nestlings as well, and their eggs. And of course, amphibians. We've got tiger salamanders, red-legged frogs, spadefoots, Oregon spotted frogs are all species at risk in BC that could be impacted by feral pigs. So where did they originate? So Eurasian wild boar species, of course, their native distribution is in Eurasia. And jumping over to North America in the States, this is a map from the USDA of feral swine populations in 2024 by county. So anywhere that a pig has been established, I think they consider established pigs, seeing a few in a group. I can't remember their exact definition, but I just want to make some context here is just because a county is lit up, it doesn't necessarily mean the entire county is full of pigs, but it does mean there's been a detection there. So it's not perfect, but it is a way of showing generally where these animals are. And up in the top right there is the same map, but from 1982. So you can see great filling in of areas of where these pigs are spreading. And as I mentioned before, they're $2.5 billion per year in control costs of the agriculture industry. And the latest estimate is that there's about 5 million feral pigs in the States. So in Canada, what does the situation look like? Again, this is not necessarily a population or distribution map, but it's from a paper by Dr. Ryan Brook from the University of Saskatchewan and one of his students, Ruth Asham, published in 2019, and it does show where pigs have been reported or seen in, and it's mapped by water bodies. But the main takeaway here is how feral pigs are mainly concentrated in our prairie provinces, and that's where we tend to have those established populations. And I'll get to BC specific in just a sec. So, feral pigs in British Columbia, just a little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned, we use the term feral pig because that is how we legislate them. So, a feral pig in British Columbia is a pig of the genus Sus that is not in captivity or not otherwise under a person's control. So essentially any pig that is loose outside of a fence and not in someone's control. So this includes domestics, it includes animals that may not be so domestic or have been living out for longer term. But that's how we use that term in British Columbia. It's a little bit different across Canada and in each province. We mainly manage pigs under the Wildlife Act or the Livestock Act in British Columbia, and a risk assessment has been completed for this species several years ago, and out of that comes categorizing of invasive species. And invasive pigs were categorized as an early detection, rapid response, or EDRR. You might hear me say that again later in the presentation, an EDRR species. And the management objective for an EDRR species is eradication. So some of the ministries that are involved in feral pig management would be my ministry, Water, Land, Resource Stewardship, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment, including the Conservation Officer Service, who are responsible for enforcement of that Wildlife Act. And in BC, as you heard Chris mention in the intro, do have a BC feral pig working group that helps coordinate our response to the species. So just quickly on the EDRR species, as I mentioned, we have a risk assessment. There are several steps to this EDRR process. But essentially, these animals are deemed to be provincial EDRR, and that management objective is eradication. So our response is important. So what is happening in British Columbia? I've just taken some headlines from the past several years, and there's, things reported anywhere from that BC is being overrun to they're imaginary. So what is actually happening? And here I hope to give you some information. So this is a map of all of our confirmed observations of feral pigs for the past basically 30 years. And as you can see, we have reports throughout most of the province. And in general, a lot of the time, these are escaped domestics that are recaptured or eradicated. Sometimes the pig is found deceased. But we do have areas where we classify it as an unknown outcome, even if we potentially have an idea of what happened there. We don't want to say, that we know for sure. So we classify that as unknown. So there are a couple areas of the province, one being the Caribou region, which is in the central area, and also in the Peace region, that are of greatest concern to us, that are not in so much urban areas. There's a lot of rural landscape, a lot of vast landscape where we, unless we're looking, it's hard to know what's happening. So are these all domestic pigs that people are free roaming and they're coming back every once in a while, or are they truly out there living on the landscape? So far, we don't have any established populations that we know of. We have not found any, and by established, I mean pigs that are living free on the landscape and self-reproducing. However, we do have these two locations that we are mostly concerned about, where we focus a lot of our efforts, which I'll get into. So the feral pig reporting, I'll have to update it from last year, but you can see we generally get, and these are reports to the ministry, to the province, so there could be reporting elsewhere that eventually trickles to us, but in general, it had been, maybe 1 to 3 or 4 animals every year reported until the last few years, where we've really ramped up a lot of messaging. I started in this role at the end of 2019 and really took on feral pig file, and a lot started happening in 2020 across the country as well with national campaigns. So you can see that I don't think this is necessarily representing an increase in pigs out on the landscape, but it is showing that we have an increased reporting based on some of our outreach efforts. And this has been seen in other provinces too, where education campaigns really do drive reporting. So we're hoping to continue with that. So in British Columbia, how do we respond? These are all photos of reports that come in. So you can see there's quite a vast, well, a diverse assortment, I suppose, of the types of reports that we get. So we have pigs wandering around in urban areas, on roadsides, which, of course, belong to someone. They're domestic and are quickly recaptured. Pigs that are found deceased, pigs that are seen on trail cameras, pot-bellied pigs that are observed, pigs on golf courses, and then a sounder of pigs that ended up in the center there, ended up belonging to someone who had just moved to a rural property and were under the assumption that they could free roam their pigs on Crown land, which of course is not allowed. So these are kind of an assortment of the types of reports that we get, and we treat them all essentially the same in that we want to respond and make sure they're removed from the landscape. But each case it's really case by case dependent. It involves a lot of collaboration, coordination between ministries, because of course, when we have domestic pigs, our Livestock Act kicks in and our Ministry of Agriculture can be involved. If they're out more in a natural landscape, manage them as, essentially wildlife under the Wildlife Act. So there can also be, when they're domestic, there can also be animal welfare concerns. So SPCA has been involved in some respects, and also RCMP. So it can get quite complex, but generally we work together to respond to see what the best method is. It generally involves talking to the owner to recapture their animals, and then rarely we need to come in and actually do the trapping ourselves if the owner isn't responsive. And of course, along with that comes a lot of education, not just on, feral pigs being bad themselves, but how to fence properly and that type of thing. As I mentioned, some cases are complex and require a lot more investigation. But generally, we follow our internal response plan for managing these reports. Some of the other things that we're doing in BC, so monitoring, of course, taking in those public reports, as I mentioned, which is a passive way of monitoring. We have a report Invasives app. So if you're in BC and you don't have this app, I encourage you to get it. And also an online form if you prefer to use it that way as well. So we continue to use that passive monitoring method, but we're also doing more active monitoring. So in those, especially in those two areas that I mentioned, the Caribou and the Peace region, we do heli surveys, looking for pigs and pig sign and routing, on foot surveys, of course, in areas where we've had reports, and working with trail cameras, working with some of our partners using trail cameras. And we're also just two or 3 weeks ago put on an eDNA training course. So we're hoping to incorporate that into some of our work as well, for feral pigs and other invasives. Management tools that we have. So this is just a screenshot of a dashboard that we use for staff working on pig issues and to share information as well. So instead of just a static map where you see dots in a map, you could click on these and see, the metadata behind it. So what happened to that pig, who was involved in the reporting and the response, just in case, another report pops up. It's really handy to look back at this data and have it in this format. We also check where we do our surveys, and that type of thing. So this is something that we're using internally for management. And then education and outreach, we do work with partners, which I'll get to in a minute, but the province ourselves has a few things. So our invasive species alert page, which we have for every invasive animal. We have a newer infographic that I mentioned, but also targeting small lot pork producers. There's a few documents that can help there where coming from Ministry of Agriculture and Food. So there's a wild and feral pigs in Canada section that outlines the risk and how to properly fence and that type of thing. So there's a few resources out there. So coordination across Canada and international, I'm not going to go through this line by line. I just threw up these images to show just how many groups are working on the wild pig problem. Generally, there's two general streams of working groups or committees, one being feral pig focused and one being African swine fever focused, and then with subgroups working on the wild pig problem through that to make sure that we're ready for response. So across Canada, this infographic is a little bit old now, but essentially we're working with folks like CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, um, Animal Health Canada. There's operational groups, strategic groups, and yeah, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of coordination across Canada and also internationally as well. So Canada has a wild pig strategy, which is a living document to guide wild pig management. And this was coordinated by Animal Health Canada and the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So we want to make sure that we're also aligning with that to accomplish the objectives, but also vice versa, what in the strategy is lacking that we may need to vouch for us in BC because we do have a little bit different of an issue, whereas most of our pigs are escaped domestics versus actual wild boar living as wild pigs. The CanSpot ASF program is a national surveillance program for African swine fever, and there was recently released a wild pigs is one of the surveillance targets that was implemented last July in 2024. So we want to make sure any pigs that we are removing or capturing are tested for ASF through our laboratories. And then, of course, currently one of the main things that we're doing through the leadership group is a mapping subgroup. So making sure we have accurate mapping, not just within each province, because we're doing a pretty good job of that, but across Canada, so that we can show the public, but also our trading partners what is happening, what we're doing in terms of wild pigs and disease risks. So we also have several exercises. I highlighted one here being a Pacific Northwest cross-border tabletop exercise, which was held a couple Octobers ago now in Spokane, Washington. So this was sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security. So it just gives you an idea of the level of threat that disease, foreign animal disease, and wild pigs does raise with our partners. And essentially, it was a scenario where you all sat in a room and worked through an exercise on invasive species being feral pigs, and also if a foreign animal disease scenario was attached to that being African swine fever. So this had a really great participation. We had 50 people in person, I believe, and even more people virtually from all different kind of branches and groups. And we also have had, I don't think I have it in my slides here, but the last few weeks even, there's been a few events related to feral pigs in BC run by the Invasive Species Council, working with them on a few items as well. So lots happening all the time on pigs. As was mentioned earlier too, we have a BC Feral Pig Working Group. This is formed by ministries of Walrus, my ministry, Forestry, Agriculture, Environment, and it's really how we coordinate our actions here. And so when the group was first started up, we were clarifying roles and responsibilities. So as I mentioned, we did have a lot of cross-jurisdictional issues, and so it just helped us, be able to respond even faster because this is an EDRR species, to have that clarified for each case. We have that internal response plan, and one of our goals as well is to continually support adoption of that response plan within each ministry and make sure we're, continually all on board. We also do other activities. I've mentioned one here, contributing to Wildlife Act revisions. It's currently being reviewed, and we were providing input based on our experiences with managing feral pigs, and seeing what we could improve there in the Wildlife Act as well. Just some next steps for monitoring. Of course, we want to keep going with those active surveys, passive as well, and trying to increase reporting. Maintain the CanSpot ASF program through that disease surveillance, working on camera monitoring, and then I mentioned eDNA, which is just going to be another tool that we can use in this vast toolbox because not one method is going to be successful. We're going to need to use a lot to make sure we're monitoring for pigs in BC because we are in a pretty unique situation where we could prevent establishment of these populations. In the middle here is just a shot. It's a little bit out of date now from Alberta, and it just shows where they've had reports of wild boar at large. And you can see in one of the counties close to the BC border, just on the top left there, kind of northwest, is there aren't actually currently wild boar in Alberta right there on the border, but within this county there have been in previous years. And so it's just a highlight to show if there was anywhere where we were concerned about pigs moving, that would be it. Although it's more likely that British Columbia would create our own feral pigs through releasing our domestics and other things like that. So basically, we're perfectly capable of creating our own problem, and that's what we're hoping to prevent here. So our other next steps are continuing to work on outreach. As I mentioned, working with Invasive Species Council of BC, who are successful in getting some federal funding to do that Squeal on Pigs campaign, which they are in the final stages of. So we're really excited about that, and they're doing a great job here in BC on those materials. So look out for those. And then, of course, we want to continue to maintain and increase our collaboration with other groups, with those national and international working groups. It really helps us learn and plan. We're basically, on the coattails of others who are dealing with this problem front and center, and so it helps us to refine and adapt our feral pig response as we go. Working with other levels of government and including First Nations government, where we have projects on the go for feral pigs and invasives, communities, industry groups, continuing the info sharing among partnerships. And one of the things that we've been doing in the past couple of events that have been held on these feral pig workshops is having a session on creating a BC strategy to keep BC feral pig free. So our ministry has our internal response plan, but we would like to form a strategy, co-create it from the ground up with our partners, whether that be industry, the pork industry, which is small in BC, but we have a lot of small holders. So working with those groups, working with First Nations, other levels of government, and other NGOs, BC Wildlife Federation, all sorts of organizations to make sure that everyone is on the same page about feral pigs and also identified in the strategy how we can move forward and what they might need to help within their membership and citizens to see, what they can contribute to the strategy and what they can get out of it so that we're not just creating a document that sits on a shelf, but something that can really help people. So I think that is it from me. So I think we've got plenty of time for questions, which was my intention. And if you have any questions later on that pop into your mind, feel free to email me there at emily.lomas@gov.bc.ca. So with that, Chris, I'll pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. That was a great presentation. It looks like y'all are on top of things in BC and doing a lot of great work. It's good to see the numbers were relatively low and hopefully they stay low going forward. So yeah, if anyone has questions, please pop them in the chat. I did have I had a couple questions. One was the distribution of feral pig sightings. A lot were kind of in the south. I know most of those are probably just released from domestic within BC, but are pigs migrating up from the US? Is that a worry for you guys?
No, I mean, if if feral, there's been instances in Montana, for instance, where reports came in of a group of pigs. And so, if that were to happen and it was near the border, of course we would, be involved, be kind of concerned, but that was quickly investigated and taken care of. So there aren't established populations along the border uh, states. And I can't speak for other provinces, but in BC, we do have there's an informal agreement right now with Washington that if they have any reports within the counties abutting our border, they let us know. And if we have any reports, I think it's within so many kilometers from the border, we let them know. And we have actually had domestic pigs cross the border from Washington to BC. So it created some funny confusion, and they were of course domestic pigs and quickly recaptured. But that's where that tabletop scenario came in, and it wasn't that far-fetched because we have had pigs cross the border, and if we were in the middle of a disease concern, that would be a pretty major issue. So no, we're not really concerned about pigs moving up from the state.
Sweet. And that's good to hear that there's open communication between you folks. Let's see. We have a couple questions here. What are your thoughts on using genetic modifications to reduce fertility as a method of controlling wild boar in Canada?
Oh, that's a good question and something I don't know a lot about. It's not something we've looked into because we don't have these populations to do that. So just to understand a little bit more, do you mean doing that within any wild pigs or within domestic pigs that we don't want to go wild? Could you maybe just read it again, if you don't mind?
Yeah, using genetic modifications to reduce fertility as a method for controlling wild boar. So I suppose maybe capturing wild boar and then doing these
Yeah,
modifications.
yeah, I guess the only reason you would do that is if you wanted to maintain wild boar on the landscape still, in the meantime. And so it's something that we don't want to encourage because we don't want to encourage a hunting culture for pigs in anywhere. The research has shown over and over if you do that, you're just increasing your pig populations because people like those hunting opportunities. You may have seen these pig hunts in the States, in Texas. It's become a big um, uh, big budget item. And so it's also encouraged people to move feral pigs around in the States. They've done genetic testing, seeing where pigs have come from. And, if someone goes on a visit to Texas, let's say, and enjoys feral pig hunting, and they think, hey, I've got a big, vast piece of property, or there's lots of, you know, public land near where I live, I'm going to bring some back and release them. And that has happened. And so we don't want to encourage that. Really, our goal would be eradication and not any kind of modification. But it's not something that I know a lot about or have looked into for here. I'm not probably not the best person to answer that.
Oh, good. That makes sense. Let's see. We have these good questions coming in here. Can you explain a little more about some of the tools used to detect invasive wild pigs? Like you mentioned eDNA, and just wondering how that works and how accurate that is.
Yeah, so eDNA has been used in the States quite a lot, and it has been more recently been researched in Alberta and Manitoba. Manitoba Squeal on Pigs group has been working with Assiniboine College on that work, just finding that some of the methods used in the States might not work here because maybe we have different landscapes, maybe we have different numbers of pigs, and so the detection is a little bit different. So they're really refining those methods, and we're kind of riding on their coattails. So for eDNA, it's not going to allow us to necessarily walk out into the middle of nowhere and take a sample and say if there's pigs or not. It's going to help us in certain situations where maybe we've had historical reports in and around a watershed. We don't have a great idea of what's happening. Maybe access is really limited. Maybe we're having issues with people stealing trail cameras or, all sorts of things like that. And So it can help in those situations where you're really trying to narrow down where pigs are or maybe where they have been. One thing in BC that we're looking into its use for is in snow tracking. So tracks for feral pigs are or pigs that are hard to distinguish depending on the snow level between ungulates, between basically deer. Um, so what you can do in that instance is if you're unsure what the track is, and the animals are long gone and there's no sense setting up any trail cameras, or maybe you're doing it in conjunction, we're looking at the viability of taking snow samples, which has been done for eDNA for other species, and then being able to tell if that was a pig or not. And so that could help in that scenario. And then there's another way that we're hoping eDNA may be useful is in enforcement files. So sometimes when we're doing these aerial surveys, we might see areas outside of fence lines where pigs have damaged habitat through their rooting. And if that's on, non-public land or maybe someone else's public land, or they've damaged a special riparian area, water course, but the pigs have since gone back to the private property or they're not there anymore. It's very hard to pursue enforcement and to recover costs for that ecosystem recovery without proof of what the animal was. And so we could use eDNA in that sense to say, yes, there were pigs here and this matches with the rooting damage. So those are some ways I'm envisioning seeing it. It's just going to be another tool to help us. We're not going to be able to replace everything else with eDNA. But we also, this is just one species that I work on, so eDNA is going to be very helpful. Some of our other aquatic invasives as well for monitoring and detection.
Awesome. That's cool that you can collect a snow sample and determine if wild pigs were there. That's cool.
When I learned that, I thought that was pretty neat. Our instructor told us that there was a case where they're really trying to see if it was lynx or bobcat, because lynx had been extirpated from one area, and so they used the DNA in snow to determine which the species were. So that's just one example of how that's being used.
Very cool. Let's see. You mentioned African swine fever being a big issue. I had one question on that. Has there been any cases of African swine fever in the US or Canada? And what about avian flu? Are pigs a potential carrier for that?
So there hasn't been any African swine fever in Canada or the US. The closest it has been detected, it has been in the Hispaniola on the island there. So the USDA has been involved with that. So mostly it has been in Europe and has been very impactful to the pork industry there. So we definitely don't want it here, but no detections here. And then for the avian flu, Was that the second part of the question?
Yeah, someone asked, what about avian flu with the fact that it increases the possibility to evolve on human avian flu, was the question.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that. So anything I say would just be speculating. I don't I don't know if pigs could be vectors or hosts for that, unfortunately.
Awesome. That's all good. Let's see. We have a few more. Curious what feral pigs are most often seeking as a food source in BC.
That's a good question. We don't know. We're not studying that. As I said, we haven't come across any actual established populations that are truly living wild. It doesn't mean necessarily that there aren't some out there. We do have some areas where people are free roaming their pigs quite frequently, and but this is in grassland area, so we don't have the crops in BC that you see in the prairies, and that's something that pigs would be the high food value item that they would go for. My understanding in BC is they would be competing for those plant species, those things that our ungulates might browse on, but also rooting for anything in the soil, any grubs, any roots, that type of thing, in the vegetation. So they can they can really eat almost anything. There's photos of pigs um, running off with a fawn, a deer fawn, so they can predate on small animals, um, and they can eat eggs. So in BC, we just don't have enough information to say, what they would be eating, but I think they would manage pretty well in most areas, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. They eat garbage too, right? They eat pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Sweet. Let's see. You spoke about needing a toolbox of tools, but has there been one tool that has been game changing for pig surveillance? And can you see any other tools coming down the pipeline like AI or remote sensing for early detection of wild pigs?
Yeah, one thing I actually forgot to mention is drones. So drone surveys, and I think that's really going to help us in certain areas. So, and it's been done a lot more in other provinces and in other states, remote sensing drones with thermal cameras. So, um, especially when you're working in cropland and cornfields, you would never see those animals in that vegetation unless you were using thermal sensing. So it is something that we're looking into here. I completely forgot to mention that. And I think that's really going to be helpful because it's going to be a lot more cost effective than aerial surveys. The aerial surveys are important though because we do have these areas that we have to get out to, and they allow us to look into areas of reports, but also just monitor areas that we're concerned on. And they also help us monitor for areas where we knew perhaps there was an issue before and make sure that, fencing has been fixed or something like that, in addition to just talking to the pig owners. So I don't think it's going to replace that, but using drones is going to be a big thing. There's a lot there's a lot more that could be done with cameras, but the thing with pigs and what my colleagues in other provinces are saying is that these pigs that are truly living wild really have their routes of travel. And so if you're not right on that route, you're not going to see them. So it's a bit different than doing maybe a standard survey for other wildlife, especially when your main goal is eradication. You're really just trying to find those animals, not kind of get a census of population density, that type of thing. So, like I said before, I don't think you could pick one over the other, but I think they're all going to be important.
So, we've heard that drones being effective for other invasive species. Shout out to our one of our previous webinar series. Someone talked about using drones and remote sensing. Just thought I'd plug that. Um, I had another question. Say you get a sighting of a wild pig from the public. They report a observation of a feral pig. What does the response look like on your side? Do you go out there, start setting up traps, or what's the next steps?
Yeah, definitely traps aren't the first step, but so how we do it following our response plan is a report comes in. And if a report comes in through our app, by the way, it comes directly to me, so in real time. So it's really handy that way. But of course, we receive reports through other avenues that eventually trickle into us. So myself and my colleague Connor Dolahan, who's also working on the feral pig file, what we will do is essentially do a bit of a desktop investigation. So where is this pig been spotted? Um, have we had pigs spotted in this area before? Get confirmation. This is really important because, and it's why I only show confirmed observation sightings. We have a lot more that, have come in over the years that aren't confirmed. And I say that from personal experience because I had someone report a pig. They were very adamant it was a feral pig. Living kind of in this area and said they had tracks, they had camera footage of it on their trail cameras. So I said, okay, great. I set up this response, called all these people. And in the meantime was receiving these photos, and the photos came and it ended up being a coyote. So I really, really stress the ID is really important. Um, so yeah, so we just kind of assess the situation. Where is it? Is it in town? Obviously, in that sense, it's going to be someone's pigs that have lost. So we may rely on a regional employee from Ministry of Agriculture who works with livestock producers, or some of our partners to go out and say, hey, who does this belong to? And often in that kind of case, the problem is already on its way to being fixed because people don't want to lose their animals, right? Unless it's just an accident. So in that sense, that's how we would approach it. Let's say we had a pig sited in the middle of nowhere, which we have a couple, or not in the middle of nowhere, but in more, rural environment. We have a couple situations like that right now, which we require looking into and phoning a lot of people to be like, who knows about this? What's going on? Finding out who the owner of the land is or the land manager. Sometimes we deal with forestry companies, and really just doing all that info gathering, and that's done with Connor and myself. And then from there, our response will be dependent on what we find out. So essentially, if we need more information, we get a regional biologist or someone regionally if we can, or ourselves if we can go there and set up trail cameras or go door to door and talk to people. So it's definitely not trapping is the first. Trapping is quite intensive and really kind of depends on the situation. Often these animals are quite domestic, and so they don't require the same type of trap setup or trap, you know, uh, pre-baiting and all this stuff that you would do for more wild pigs. So it really does depend. And also in BC currently, and no current plans to change it, but hunting is permitted. And so we have had situations where hunters have helped us to remove animals off the landscape that are loose. And we know where they're loose from, but the owner refuses to cooperate, and now they're really living out there. And so we've used hunters. Of course, if we were to come across a whole sounder, the research says that hunting is not good. It can split the sounder, send them further afield. So it's not really an eradication method, but for our one-off animals, we can work with hunters to help with that too. So it's really been a total array of methods, and it just depends on the situation. But because Connor and I, we're actually located in different areas in the province, and so we can't be everywhere. So that's why we have that response plan so that we identify regionally who can help in these situations.
Awesome. That sounds like a good response plan. And to be fair to that one person, coyotes and wild pig do look remarkably similar, I think. Um, Sweet. I think we might end things there. So Emily, thanks so much for taking the time to present with us. Really great
You're
stuff you
welcome.
guys are doing in BC. And thanks everyone for joining us today.